You know, early morning is my favourite time of the day. If you get up early, before the sun has risen over the Temple Mount, you can pretty well guarantee that most people will still be in bed, or at least still at home getting ready to go out. I can walk through the city streets without being jostled and pushed, and without having to weave my way through crowds, even at times when the city is crowded, like the Passover. I like the quietness of the streets, hunkered down in the early morning, as if they were waiting for the day to begin. I'm a solitary bird, and I get lots of time to think, but people tend to avoid me, you know, because I deal with something that people don't like to think about: death. You see, I'm one of the ones that look after the various public graves around the city. Now, I also look after some private gardens too, so people prefer to call me a gardener. I don't really mind what they call me, really. I don't care what they think of my job. I like it. I like the solitude and the quietness of a graveyard. It doesn't frighten me to spend my days around the dead. In fact, it's not the dead you need to worry about, in my opinion. It's the living. On this particular morning, it was the first day of the week, and the first after a double Passover Sabbath. I was making my way to work as normal. I just got to the turning at Gold Street when a woman came careering round the corner without warning, and she cannoned into me. We both fell over, gripping each other as we fell. Luckily for her, she fell on top of me, but we were both winded. As we staggered to our feet and catching our breath, I took a look at her. She was relatively young, 20, 21, dressed in drab, ordinary clothes and with a headscarf covering her hair. She was pretty, some might even say she was beautiful, but her face was flushed from the fall, and her hair had broken free of the scarf and now kind of hung down across her face, so she wasn't looking her best. Her eyes, though, now they were something else. Shining they were, as if she'd been crying, though whether it's tears of joy or tears of grief, it was difficult to know. It became apparent, though, because I knew her. Mind you, to say I knew her is a bit of an exaggeration. I ought to say I had met her. I met her for the first time only 3 days ago, when I complied with the strangest request. One of my patrons, Joseph, the very well-connected trader from Arimathea, he'd asked me to prepare his grave for use. Now, I've had some strange requests before, but I've never had the potential deceased organising his own funeral. I did as I was told, though, but because it was the eve of the Sabbath, it was all done on the hurry-up. I did the bare minimum I needed, and then I was to come back on the first day of the week and kind of do all the rest of the things. So it was a bit of a surprise, really, that early morning that I'd literally ran into one of the women that had brought the body to this garden tomb on that Friday night. Her name was Mary. She was from Magdala. As soon as she was up off the floor, rather off of me, she took one look to make sure I was okay, and then she took off like a scolded cat. I didn't even have time to speak to her, so I just shrugged my shoulders and carried on. Very soon after, I heard a commotion behind me, and this time I took the precaution. I stepped into an alleyway, and then 3 people rushed past me. Now, one of them was this Mary again. I was beginning to realise that something odd was happening, and it kind of struck me whether it had something to do with what we did on Friday and Jesus the Nazarene that we buried. You know, I thought about Jesus as I walked to tend his grave. You see, I'd seen him around and about Jerusalem. I'd even heard him preach. My wife swore that he'd healed her cousin of his blindness by asking him to bathe in the pool of Siloam. I was impressed with Jesus whenever I'd seen him, Even though I'm not particularly religious, I kind of go through the motions, really. What Jesus taught, it made sense. Unlike what I was used to hearing from the Pharisees and the scribes. You see, they always seem to cast God in their own mould, if you ask me. Their God was pretty stern, unbending and unforgiving. Whereas the God Jesus talked about seemed much more approachable, much more like a father ought to be, which is how Jesus kind of taught people that we should think about God. What troubled me, though, was what Jesus expected was a total faith in this Father God. At the time, I didn't see much evidence in Israel of that kind of faith. But if anyone was going to convince me, it would be Jesus. Well, it would have been if they hadn't killed him. You see, I was pretty much on the way to believing that there might be something in our old religion after all, thanks to Jesus. I haven't felt the stirrings of what might be called faith. But those stirrings were snuffed out like a weak candle that Friday when the sky turned black at midday. That was the day they crucified Jesus, and I then helped bury him in the tomb of Joseph. I couldn't do much for Jesus when he was alive. I mean, after all, what could a grave tender do for the kingdom that Jesus spoke about? But I certainly could help give him a proper and a fitting burial, even if he was killed like a common criminal. Before I got to the garden entrance, two men I knew to be disciples of Jesus came back past me in the opposite direction. What on earth was going on, I wondered. They'd not long passed me in that way in a tearing hurry, and now they were staggering back towards me like drunkards. In their eyes I could see, kind of almost fear, really. They looked like they'd seen a ghost. As I entered the garden, Mary came out. She looked drunk as well. She wasn't walking so much as gliding, almost dancing towards me, and there's such an unearthly smile on her face, wondering sort of as if she'd kind of woken up from a nightmare and kind of realised it was all over. She looked up at me and her smile widened. "You're not needed, Benjamin," she said. "You might as well go home." She was past me before I could even get my response. "What do you mean?" I asked. She didn't stop dancing. She just spun on her heels, really, and then said, "You'll find out." She spun around a couple more times as she headed out towards the city, and then called back over her shoulder, "The whole world will find out." Well, I did find out, and so did the whole world, didn't it? Now, I know some people claim that it was a kind of trick, that maybe Jesus wasn't really dead and the cool of the tomb revived him. Or some people say that someone had removed the body, but that's all pub talk. I saw him die, and I saw him when he was dead. I manhandled the body, for goodness sake. You think I don't know what death looks like? What really convinced me, though, wasn't Simon Peter blabbing his mouth off. It wasn't Mary dancing around in the early morning dew. For me, it was the stone. You see, it took 5 of us to move that stone, and it took us nearly an hour. It would have taken 5 of us at least an hour to remove it again, because in my experience it always takes you longer to take the stone out than it does to put it in. I know that no one had been in the garden at any time since the previous Friday, let alone 5 men, because the priests had put a guard on the tomb. And yet when I reached it, the stone lay on the grass a good 10 yards away. For all the world it looked like a pea had been popped out of a pod. In all my life, I've never been so glad to lose a job as I was that day. You see, 5 men couldn't have done that. but God could have done. And I think, no, I believe he did.